Um, so, so just to start, I'd like to provide a little context for where today's talk fits into my broader research. I'm writing a book on early 20th century bookselling, and in particular, where bookselling intersected with several literary networks. Booksellers have hosted literary events, fostered communities, and yes, published members of their orbit. So the way these bookshops functioned paved the way for the rise of independent bookshops in the mid to late 20th century. These spaces provided opportunities for browsing, socializing, and organizing events, features we now consider commonplace in bookshops. So while my research is interested in the manifold ways that these shops operated, and I view this as a fundamental shift in the form of bookselling, my focus today is only on one area of engagement, which is publishing. So why would small businesses take on additional financial risks in order to publish works with little chance of earning a direct profit? What were the motivations and why did it matter to them? Publishing Your Friends, in reviewing several bookshops in the US, Britain, and France, argues for a structural shift in the form of bookselling, of publishing as an expression of the shop's identity. And however different the motivations or outcomes were bookshop to bookshop, collectively they indicate that these publishing ventures were not book trade outliers, but rather a recognition of new and challenging forms of literary production and its consumption. So I've taken inspiration for the title of this talk from a catalog published by Gotham Book Mart in 1940, called We Moderns. Um, just as a quick aside, there are plenty of copies of this online, and it's well worth getting, even if as you can see from this photograph, the binding and the format is atrocious. It's a ring binding. Your eyes are not deceiving you, but it's a really wonderful catalog. So entitled We Moderns, Gotham Book Mart, 1920 to 1940, it features a photo by notable literary patron and photographer Carl Van Vechten of it's a photo of a Finnegan's Wake garden party. And it's in celebration of the 1939 publication of James Joyce's last novel. Gotham Book Mart's 42nd bookseller catalog, in addition to the expected listings of stock for sale, features short write-ups of authors by their peers. They are familiarly worded bits of text on their peers' consequence and character. And I'm not expecting all of these names will resonate, but here are some of which did for me. So this is just a long list because I think it's the kind of aggregation of these names is kind of what makes it impressive. So Alfred Kreinborg on Conrad Aiken, Richard Eberhard on W.H. Auden, Kay Boyle on Juna Barnes, William Saroyan on Bob Brown, Delmore Schwartz on Hart Crane, John Dos Passos on E.E. Cummings, Ezra Pound on T.S. Eliot, Sherwood Anderson on William Faulkner, Eugene Jolas on James Joyce, Genevieve Taggart on C.Day Lewis, W.H. Auden on Lewis McNeese, James Laughlin on Henry Miller, John Wheelwright on Kenneth Patchen, E.E. Cummings on Ezra Pound, Kenneth Patchen on Stephen Spender, Carl Van Vechten on Gertrude Stein, Conrad Aiken on Wallace Stevens, and many more. There's a lot of coverage. It wants to communicate that there's a collective here to be reckoned with, we moderns. It builds associations between all these writers under the banner of modernism, to be sure, but importantly, it also creates an association between all of these writers, modernism, and the bookshop. Publishing Your Friends not only refers to those instances of intimacy and direct patronage between bookseller and author, but also how booksellers narrated literary associations through publications. How, for example, Sylvia Beach profited from the international knowledge that she, under her bookshop's imprint, published Ulysses, even as the book and its author were financial burdens on her. How much business in total did publishing and distributing this book drum up beyond the sales of the title itself? A quantitative answer to such a question, even in Beach's case, where many of her business records survive, would be difficult to arrive at, but the suggestion is there. James Joyce was good business. From this perspective, then, the emphasis of this talk is less about the state of early 20th century publishing and more about the state of early 20th century bookselling. None of the publishing decisions by booksellers which I'm reviewing here make much market sense, or rather, they do not reflect macro-scale histories of book publishing. The trade was dominated at the time by large publishing firms, and while many booksellers still published titles, it had become rare for a bookseller to solely stock what they printed. Booksellers like Brentano's, D. Appleton and Company, and W.H. Smith all had their own publications, but these were large businesses which stocked thousands of titles. And in the case of the first two, by the interwar period, their consequence in the book trade was flagging. On the other hand, as we will see with the Paris-based booksellers discussed here, a bookseller might provide an alternative publishing venue when the mainstream trade failed to take on the work, often out of fear of obscenity charges. So for today, I've decided on a slightly different order than what was advertised on the website. I will first review some examples of magazine publications and then move on to booksellers who backed book publications. And I've done this to more easily spotlight the individual booksellers case by case, rather than cross-cutting between them and losing you all on who is who. So this is just kind of a show and tell of different booksellers, more than the original intention. So starting with the magazine. And I should probably also say, this can come up in the Q&A, I've deliberately left out catalogs, which I treat separately elsewhere in my research. I'm not covering that today. But the magazine. So another reason I've sequenced the talk in this manner has to do with the geographic dynamic when it comes to interwar literary magazine publishing. There's not an insignificant number of modernist magazines published by London booksellers. There are a few factors likely at work here. Booksellers would have had access to more cheap print surfaces, for example. The Poetry Bookshop used W.H. Smith's printers early on, the Arden Press. Modernist magazines like Blast or the publishing regime of Harold Monroe's The Poetry Bookshop would have been of major consequence for new and aspiring booksellers. As Andrew Nash and Simon Elliott have observed with late 19th century poetry publishing, quote, poetic movements have often been mediated through publishing enterprises. In the 1890s, Elkin Matthews and John Lane, partners in the Bodley Head, created a vogue for attractively produced volumes, which gave impetus to the poets of that decade. They go on to note that, quote, poetry publishing had such a small market that men like Lane, Matthews, and as we'll see below, Harold Monroe, saw it as a specialist activity, demanding its own brand of niche bookselling. So while I'm not that fussed with genre distinctions today, especially as I see booksellers as publishers of opportunity over taste or preference, as we will see with some of these magazines, poetry lent itself to the publishing format more readily, more often than prose. So, starting with Coterie. Coterie, and then there's also another journal called New Coterie. The common link between Coterie and New Coterie is an editor named Russell Green, who edited both. He took over from, I hope I'm pronouncing this right, Shaman Lal, towards the end of the former's run as editor. The other commonality is that the journals were addressed at bookshops. So Coterie was at Henderson's The Bomb Shop, and New Coterie at E. Archer's, or the Progressive Bookshop. There's not much information about Henderson's out there other than through scattered accounts. It mainly sold leftist literature and published titles on like Trotsky, art, theater, poetry. And for me, as a tantalizing aside, for a time they were alongside the Poetry Bookshop, listed as the London distributors of C.K. Ogden's Cambridge Magazine. Henderson's was at 66 Charing Cross Road, which was later Colette's bookshop. And as Dave Cope has pointed out, they were not the only bomb shop in the UK. So Dave Cope has located bomb shops in Swansea, Birmingham, and Bristol in the 1910s, 1920s, and 1930s, respectively. It appears to be kind of a reference to radical, what do I try to say? Kind of violent radical action on the left, the willingness to like blow things up, I guess. I guess we get it. There's no indication there's any affiliation amongst these bomb shops, in other words. So Coterie is notable for the number of young careers it helped along. Works by Amy Lowell, Aldous Huxley, and T.S. Eliot can be found in its pages. At the back of several issues, Henderson's books were listed in the section at the bomb shop. So you can get a sense of what they were stocking as well. New Coterie, which was revived by Russell Green in 1925, and now distributed by Charles Law's Progressive Bookshop at 68 Red Lions Street, also clearly tied the connection between the magazine and the bookshop, significantly linking the authors they published with the stock they carried. So there's a few things to look at here. There's Lara in the doorway of his bookshop. That's one issue where you can see that they have recently, the stock they're carrying by authors of New Coterie, next to kind of facing the title page, the table of contents of that issue. So Lara's bookshop, originally Esther Archer's, which is named after his wife, as the name indicates, sold much progressive and radical literature, and did much to help distribute an edition of D.H. Lawrence's Lady Chatterley's Lover and Pansies, published the controversial James Hanley novel, The German Prisoner, and hosted Nancy Kennard while she was compiling the Negro anthology. And Lara himself befriended C.L.R. James, providing James with his early reading on Marxism and the Russian Revolution. And since he's here, I should point out Andrew Thacker has written a lot on Progressive Bookshop, and I'll defer all questions about Lars to Andrew during the Q&A if it comes up. He knows a lot more about it than I do. Moving on to the Poetry Bookshop. So before even you have Coterie and New Coterie, you have Harold Monroe's Poetry and Drama. Poetry and Drama's publication essentially coincided with Harold Monroe opening the Poetry Bookshop. The magazine was initially a reaction to a tiff Monroe had with the powers that be at the Poetry Society over his editorship of the Poetry Review. Poetry and Drama is perhaps more productively viewed as a calling card for the fledgling bookshop. J. Howard Woolmer's bibliography of the bookshop's publications notes that the first issue featured a tipped-in prospectus about the new bookshop, and I'm still in the process of tracking this down. I don't know. I can't find a copy of it, the prospectus. He also notes that from the second issue on, tickets for Poetry Bookshop readings were included. Featuring maps to 35 Devonshire Street and recently received notices, which were not uncommon for a magazine to have, but in this instance, it strongly suggested that these titles were also on the shelf for purchase. Poetry and Drama presented a community of authors linked to the bookshop. The First World War ended Poetry and Drama's run, and in announcing a pause he doesn't announce its end, he announces a pause. Monroe plays up the magazine's importance to the national psyche. I'm just going to read a bit of this, which you have on the screen. Monroe writes, "It has become increasingly evident that the attention of the public must inevitably remain fixed on one issue only, the preservation of national liberty. The consideration and indeed the production of literature require leisure of mind. The suspension of this periodical is designed to last until we have been so fortunate as to regain that leisure. However, such lofty sentiments did not get in the way of doing business." He writes, "Meanwhile, the Poetry Bookshop will remain open for such as may need it, of course, and will maintain in every possible manner the principal interests now represented in poetry and drama." So following the war from 1919 to 1925, Monroe returned with the chapbook, which was published variously as the monthly chapbook, Poetry and Drama News Series, signaling as a successor to the pre-war publication, then the chapbook, a monthly miscellany, and ultimately the chapbook, a miscellany, when it becomes an annual late in its run. It's kind of a nightmare for a bibliographer to keep track of all the different namings. Monroe may rival Beach in terms of scholarly attention and popular memory. And for that reason, and because I want to move on to other people, I will only add that his attempt to corral and corner the poetry market served as a business inspiration for many booksellers who followed. Another London-based magazine from around the same period lent into its neighborhood identity, publishing local authors alongside figures with national profiles. Ethel Gutman, founder of the Bermondsey Bookshop in London in 1921, embraced the localism of her shop even as she drew national attention to the shop space. It was originally conceived as a meeting place for book lovers in Bermondsey, then a strongly working-class area, and locals were encouraged to sign up to a monthly membership and make use of the reading room upstairs to discuss books with other members. Bermondsey Book, which you can see a couple screen grabs on the right, as the dedication in its opening issue declares, excuse me, don't worry, I'm not reading all of this, but in a humble way, just a bit of this. In a humble way, the Bermondsey Book has for its purpose the desire to increase the spirit in all activities of life and thought. It stands or falls by the belief that all human endeavor is futile, that is not based upon and guided by the principle of each for all and all for each. The most enduring and beneficence is that which seeks to increase the love and knowledge of the written word. This was the aim of those who opened the bookshop in Bermondsey Street, and it is no less the aim of the book, the Bermondsey Book magazine, which is but the extension of effort and an increase of purpose. A life without literature and the ideals which flower from its reading is barbarism, and a nation in which the humblest and poorest cannot have free access to the thought and beauty which are its heritage exists but does not live. So in their view, the activities of the bookshop as host, as distributor, and now with the magazine were a unified effort in some form of social uplift through literature. And in what was perhaps a gesture towards their working class clientele, or the working clientele, I should say, the shop kept late hours. Their hours are advertised Monday through Friday and Sunday, 4 p.m. to 10 p.m. And they were closed on Saturdays. On Sundays, they would hold regular talks and discussions on various themes like making friends with poetry, or can one tell a good book from a bad one? And over the years, they hosted the likes of Hugh Walpole, Edith Sitwell, Harold Monroe, and Harold Lasky, among many others. And I had a quick interjection. They regularly advertise these events in Publishers Circular. And to the best of my abilities of going through that massive publication, seemed to be the only bookshop that had that space for advertising. So I'm still working on the ins and outs of that, but something to note. But I mentioned this because from its earliest days, the shop had support from influential figures in the publishing industry, like Cecil Palmer of the eponymous imprint, Cecil Palmer, and C.S. Evans, who worked for William Heinemann. And Palmer and Heinemann published issues of Bermondsey Book. So Palmer brought authors that he had published, like Florence Everett, Stacey Amonnier, and B.W. Matz, to the shop for talks. And he also chaired events and published the first years of the shop's quarterly, the Bermondsey Books. Heinemann picked up the quarterly at the time of Ethel Gutman's death in 1925 and continued to do so to the end of its run and the closing of the bookshop in 1930. So the bookshop lasted about another 5 years, and the publication lasted about another 5 years after her death. Her husband kept it open. And moving on to my favorite bookseller, which is what the Cambridge Elements is primarily about. I felt like I needed to include him. So in June 1932, a bookshop named Archer's opened at 4 Parton Street, Red Lion Square. It was a venture of the Promethean Society. The shop was established as a, quote, central distributing agency for their journal 20th Century. The Promethean Society itself was formed in March 1931, emerging from a series of discussions published in every magazine under the banner The Revolt of Youth. The Society's journal, the 20th Century, was the public expression of its interests. Despite a common view that the Society lacked direction, it established various subject groups focusing on topics like planned economics, World Federation, sexual rights, and child-centered education. And curiously, especially given that this was not a literary organization by any means, it regularly published poems and prose by notable names like T.S. Eliot, W.H. Auden, Stephen Spender, Naomi Mitchison, and George Barker. The journal initially had limited circulation, but reflected the vibrancy of the organization. John Randall Evans, the editor of 20th Century and a key figure in publishing, played a significant role in the journal's success. Evans's connections through his job as a reader at Golan's Publishing helped generate attention for the journal and by extension, the Society. And Evans is kind of one of these hidden figures of early mid-century 20th century literary publishing. The one kind of key detail about him to show you kind of his influence at Golan's was he was the reader that wrote the approving report for John le Carré's first novel. So you kind of have Evans to thank for that author. I'm sure he'd get published somewhere, but that's the story. While David Archer owned the bookshop, the idea for it likely originated within the Society as a way to benefit the journal's circulation and raise the Society's visibility. The bookshop initially advertised only in 20th Century and later expanded its reach through Geoffrey Grigson's poetry magazine, New Verse. Archer famously published the first books of Dylan Thomas and George Barker, as well as David Gascoigne's first non-self-published title. Gascoigne had self-published 2 titles before this one. Similarly to what I've acknowledged with some of these other booksellers, these literary associations through publication drew plenty of foot traffic to Parton Street. The street itself, no longer in existence, was a curious pocket in mid to late 1930s London. It also housed Lawrence and Wishart Publishers and Meg's Cafe, a favorite hangout for artists and writers. So go buy the book. I read all about it. Speaking of books, oh, I wanted to add more images here. Oh well, next time. As I've already indicated with Monroe's Poetry Bookshop and David Archer's bookshop, booksellers also invested in publishing books. Woolmer, the Poetry Bookshop's bibliographer, indicates that the business published 47 books in 2 decades. In his case, the initial inspiration was to turn the Poetry Bookshop into a kind of one-stop shop for all things new in poetry. And for a time, he made a great success of it. And while historically the idea of a bookseller being a publisher wasn't uncommon, indeed quite often the word bookseller could simply signify a printer with a shop front. By the 20th century, the trade was structured very differently. And just to give one set of data, I write elsewhere that for how many hundreds of copies of Ulysses Sylvia Beach sold, she stocked, sold, and lent thousands of other titles. And I just published an article in Logos, which is open access. You can check it out. In 1928, 1929 alone, thanks, Sam, she placed publisher orders for over 5,000 volumes, most from large publishers like Chatto and Windus, Macmillan, and Jonathan Cave. Other factors would have to come into play for one to decide to publish. With the 5 booksellers I'm discussing here, 2 in Paris and 3 in the US, each had very different motivations, even as their bottom line would have clearly been in sight. There were risks, but exciting and potentially profitable ones. So I'm guessing with this crowd, I don't have to explain how it came to pass that Sylvia Beach published James Joyce's Ulysses in 1922. So I'm going to skip over that history. But in the context of today's discussion, however, it is worth noting how Parisian booksellers got involved in the publishing of major literary works mainstream publishers either couldn't or wouldn't publish. And I should specify mainstream in the US and UK. As Colette Colligan has written in A Publisher's Paradise, Expatriate Literary Culture in Paris, Paris was a welcoming venue for bookselling and publishing experiments, such as Beach's Shakespeare and Company. Paris was, I mean, some of this it sounds kind of obvious, but Paris was a haven for artistic expression and social liberation, which were difficult to realize in Britain and America due to strict censorship laws and conservative social norms. So the city's liberal atmosphere, fueled by a thriving arts scene and a general openness to experimentation, attracted those seeking creative freedom and an escape from the repressive cultural climate of their home countries. So the suggestion I'm making is that Joyce and Beach are not quite an outlier in this milieu. And to give another example of this, at the Sign of the Black Mannequin. So another significant pairing of a major author with a seminal work and a willing Parisian bookseller publisher was D.H. Lawrence's Lady Chatterley's lover and At the Sign of the Black Mannequin proprietor Edward Titus. Born in Poland, Titus led a peripatetic life before marrying cosmetics mogul Helena Rubinstein, who financially supported his book collecting, book selling, and publishing interests. And just as a quick aside about Rubinstein, who I'm just now starting to research, so I'm not an authority on her. She has been the subject of some retrospectives and biographies. She was quite prominent in her time, quite successful. She was self-made, and she's purported to have revolutionized the beauty industry with her cosmetics company. She had these beauty salons that were also kind of social spaces. And I don't want to say more because I can't kind of competently speak to it, but she is, by all accounts, a very formidable, speaking of Sam's formidable women, she's a formidable figure of the period, excuse me. So I also pause on Rubinstein because with nearly every example I'm reviewing here today, there's a key question behind these ventures is where does the financial investment derive? In some cases like Titus, it is a wealthy backer with aesthetic interests who happens to be his wife. In Beach's case, it was her mother's life savings given shortly before her death. Ethel Gutman's husband was in finance and ran the business after her death for several years, as I noted before. And with the Sunwise turn, which I'll get to, it was the backing of several well-to-do friends and well-wishers, and so on. There was always friends and family around. There's money around. David Archer, his father sold off a bunch of land. There's answers to all this all over the place. But back to Titus and his At the Sign of the Black Mannequin. The press published about 25 books between 1926 and 1932, including Lady Chatterley's Lover. And just to kind of review Lawrence's publishing history just briefly, Lawrence had a problem. He had his novel printed in Italy by another bookseller, Davis Orioli. However, because of censorship restrictions and the cost of that edition, it was not widely distributed, and worse, pirated editions had begun to proliferate. So Lawrence went to Paris to find someone who could print a cheaper, authorized edition to combat the piracies of his work. Sylvia Beach said no, citing her loyalty to James Joyce as the reason. And eventually Lawrence met Titus, who published the book, who published this. Titus printed originally 3,000 copies of a photographic reprint of the Orioli edition. And when that sold out, he printed another 3,000 and eventually approved an additional 3,000. So it was a success by that measure. Titus also briefly owned and edited This Quarter magazine. And like the examples I reviewed above, the other magazines, it used its regular publication to promote the bookshop and his book publishing. And it remains unclear how successful or indeed how long the bookshop remained open in the 1920s. Mentions of the shop begin to fade by the late 1920s, and indeed all of Titus's publishing and bookselling in Paris ended by 1932, and unsurprisingly, Rubinstein divorced him by 1937. So this was a marriage on the rocks by the time that this all ended. Crossing the ocean to New York City, I turn your attention to perhaps the most unique of its bookshops in the early 20th century. The Sunwise Turn, opened in 1916, the shop quickly became a literary center in the city, co-founded by Madge Jennison and Mary Mowbray Clark, pictured here. The Sunwise Turn lasted just over a decade before closing in 1929. The bookshop had a notably crowded history, especially within the context of literary modernism. They considered publishing an American edition of Ulysses, counted F. Scott Fitzgerald and Wallace Stevens and Schofield Thayer and William Carlos Williams as customers. They hosted readings by Theodore Dreiser, Amy Lowell, and Patrick Cullum, and had financial backing and brief accounting help from Harold Loeb, who was the model for Robert Cohn in The Sun Also Rises, and Cohn's cousin, Peggy Guggenheim, who worked there briefly and who, by all accounts, was a terrible employee. She didn't know how to manage money, apparently. The bookshop also, yeah, you can draw your conclusions. The bookshop also published a range of pamphlets and books, including Ananda Kumaraswamy's The Dance of Shiva, 14 Indian essays, Rainer Maria Rilke's Auguste Rodin, and Alfred Kreinborg's plays for Mary Andrews. But more importantly, the Sunwise Turn established itself, similarly to Sylvia Beach's Shakespeare and Company, in Paris as a popular bookshop with a strong and lively literary association, becoming a model and influence for a bookshop we met earlier, Frances Stelloff's Gotham Book Mart. Stelloff writes about going into the Sunwise Turn and being inspired to open her shop afterwards. Of note, and something I'm still in the process of researching, the Sunwise Turn was for a time the U.S. distributor of None Such Press titles. None Such Press opened in the basement of Bloomsbury Booksellers, Birrell and Garnett. It was opened by Francis Meynell. The press printed fine editions of many works, including John Donne's love poems and an edition of the Bible and Robert Burton's Anatomy of Melancholy. So I'll get back to you on what I learned about that. But there's just an interesting connection between two of these bookshops. As for these last few booksellers, Ben Abramson of Argus Books in Chicago and the Cohns of the House of Books in New York, we're entering slightly different territory from the examples I've already gone through. Both booksellers, both shops could boast literary figures as customers and friends, but certainly in the latter case with the Cohns, these were established names with vast sums of cultural capital. For example, I was at Columbia in the archive, where the House of Books archive is, and there's a lot of correspondence between Marguerite Cohn and Valerie Elliott, including a letter where Valerie tells Marguerite she just got married and to not tell anyone. So Marguerite learns of the marriage before the world knows. And there are about 17 years worth of Christmas cards from the Elliots to the Cohns. just in the files, which is so they were close. They were close, that Christmas card close. But in both instances with Abramson and the Cohns, book publishing appears to be more opportunistic than ideological. Abramson's daughter, for example, in describing her father's over 50 book publications from the late 1920s to the 1950s, which she even admits she has no complete record of, noted that her father became a publisher because there were books he thought should be published and no one else would publish them. And this sounds pleasantly idealistic, but it does not, for example, explain his pirated edition of Lady Chatterley's Lover, or quite get at why he published 2 books by Christopher Morley and later printed Morley's Baker Street Irregulars Journal in the late 1940s. Yes, with Morley, Abramson was publishing a friend. They were quite close, Morley and Abramson. But this was a friend with a national profile. Morley was probably one of the most famous people in the US, like full stop, in this period of time. And I'm sure Abramson was highly aware of what publishing a book by Morley would get him. Abramson was a good business person until apparently his alcoholism kind of ruined him. One of his common attempts to raise money was to mail out copies of books to their authors, asking for signatures, and then resell them as collector's items. And I have for you on the screen, and I'm sorry the reply is so faded, but that's just the state of the scan. He's writing to, this is Abramson writing to Carson McCullers after she's published her first book, asking for these signatures. And by the way, Yale has this all digitized, so you can go to the Yale digital collections and see this complete correspondence. He follows up with her for The Heart of the Lonely Hunter with lists of, can you ascribe to this person and this person and this person? And she apparently seems to have complied. And she does here, but I find it kind of sweet that she's kind of, this is my first book. I have no idea what I'm doing. Sure. I don't know what you mean by inscribe. So this is the exchange, but he did this with a lot of people, and then he would sell the books at an inflated rate. And to my knowledge, none of these authors asked for a percentage in reply. Abramson is Abramson of all of these people is the most fascinating because he's also to me the biggest hustler out of all of them. Yeah, certainly the most motivated. For 2 years, he published a journal called Reading and Collecting. And it's ostensibly was what the title is about. It says it's basically just kind of collections of articles on collecting books. But each issue is just littered with ads for his bookshop, kind of in different styles and different sizes, with very creative headlines. So, so I 3 here that drew my attention. For the collector, presentation and association copies, which you just saw he was able to procure. Or I'm sorry, I got you guys. Oh, ouch, my sunburn. Why suffer needlessly from sunburn when these books will take you to the tropics safely, comfortably, and cheaply? And then there are books for sale at Argus. Or yet another one, I just love Argus salads. They're so cool and crisp. Here's a salad made of leaves and roots and other growths, cooling and refreshing, invigorating, and above all, economical. So there's something like 15 issues, and they all they read like this. His 1930s journal, Reading and Collecting, attempted to set a standard for how books ought to be collected, while regularly advertising his shop as the place to buy them, as you can see. Abramson is one of the great overlooked figures of this period. He published H.P. Lovecraft, Henry Miller, he published a commentary on T.S. Eliot, and there's a scholarly book he published on science fiction, and it's claimed to be the first scholarly work on science fiction as a genre. I don't know how accurate that claim is, but rare book dealers like to list their copies of that book with that claim. So he's worthy of a deeper dive than I can offer today. And finally, the House of Books, which was a New York City bookshop, and it was founded in September 1930 by Marguerite and Louis Cohn. And I don't have permissions to reproduce any of the photos of Louis Cohn, but he was a colonel. He was often referred to in letters as Colonel Cohn, because he fought in the First World War, and there are a lot of photos of him in like really sharp suits, erect posture, amazing hair. It's worth looking up. The shop specialized in 20th century American and British fiction and poetry, and unlike a lot of the other businesses, well, like Gotham Book Mart, House of Books survived until the early 80s, I think is when it closed. After Louis Cohen's death in 1953, Marguerite Cohen continued to run the shop independently. Between 1932 and 1969, as part of their Crown Octavo series, they published limited editions of texts by authors such as Ernest Hemingway, Thomas Wolfe, Marianne Moore, T.S. Eliot, Robert Frost, and Tennessee Williams under the House of Books imprint. In 1931, Louis Cohen had completed a bibliography of Ernest Hemingway's works, even contacting the author to make a contribution to the publication. And it was the first bibliography completed on Hemingway. So to conclude, this is a lot. There's a partnering chapter in my book that discusses how booksellers like the Cohens, Abramson, and Steloff at the Gotham Book Mart created an idea of collecting modernism. The Cohens' fine editions, Abramson's journal reading and collecting, and Steloff's stock, including such promotions as We Moderns, which I opened this talk with, signaled a new phase in booksellers' relations with this period of literary production. As these literary communities faded into history, booksellers kept capitalizing on their existence by other means, memorializing these writers and their networks on the bookshelves. The end.
Thank you. Thanks, Matt. That was really eye-opening. Do we have questions for Matthew? Sorry, my screen's doing one of those things where you. Okay, and I can see everyone again. Yes, sorry, Sam, you have a question.
It's probably an unfair question, Matt, and you may have seen me dart off while you were talking, but you've inspired me to think about this, about booksellers being kind of promoters of literature of their time. Because I don't know whether you've seen this, there's a fairly new bookstore that's opened up in London called Backstory.
Oh no.
Which is being featured a lot by the Booksellers Association, set up by a young guy, and they've just started their own journal called Backstory. This is it.
Right.
And I'm just trying to, it's making me wrap my brains to think, I'm sure there are other bookshops at the moment that probably do this, and wouldn't it be amazing to do a parallel study? Like, is there something that's similarly happening now with independent bookstores as we're kind of encountering that renaissance about identity and community that could map against what you've discovered about the early 20th century stuff?
I mean, there are a few. I mean, the Five Leaves is the one I'm kind of immediately comes to mind.
That's it, yeah.
And then, I haven't recently checked in, but I know Second Shelf, they had some problems. They got into the turf wars, and they had a publication that they were putting out. They had a literary publication magazine, and I haven't checked in with them recently, so I don't know if that journal's still alive. I have a feeling it's kind of, they got a lot of pushback, and I think they kind of decided to shut up shop. But in terms of promotion, it seems like it's easier for most booksellers to have some kind of online space. So social media, websites, and so on. So you can get your promoting, you can get your, I left out catalogs as a form of publication. Gotham Book Mart, as we saw, is a kind of uses catalogs in a very kind of creative way. So yeah, I mean, I think it's possible, and maybe I should say this differently. I'm moving back from kind of my starting point, of course, is like kind of the dawn of print, and the idea that at some point, maybe at some point in the 19th century, booksellers no longer had to print their stock necessarily, or they weren't, that kind of association was no longer so tight that you could just sell. You could just sell without having to print. And it got me thinking about why anyone would still continue to, when it didn't make a lot of financial sense, when managing a bookshop was such a risk as it was. It feels like, outside of a few examples, like the one you pointed to, that it's not somewhere post-war. I can't put my finger on it, but there just seems to be a moment where booksellers don't seem to do it as much anymore. It
Yeah.
doesn't seem to be. I shouldn't say that because I actually there's a gap in my knowledge. The 60s and 70s and the
Well,
80s.
I can fill that gap because I
Yeah.
just look at it.
I'm also thinking
And
the
as
US
far
because
as I know,
every time
yeah,
every word I'm saying out loud, I can think of another example. Like I know Andrew's written on City Lights and the kind of two
yeah.
issues they put, not City Lights, sorry, Shakespeare and Company, the second Shakespeare and Company. Um, and obviously City Lights has a kind of like strong literary connection. It's just and there's just lots of the other thing too is I'm making a kind of demarcation between like literary publishing and maybe like political publishing, because there's a ton of this in the 60s and 70s, like radical booksellers, ton of pamphleteering and so on. So it's, and I've also left out the workers' bookshops and the Communist Party in this talk as well. It's so I'm kind of cheating a little bit to make this point. Um, and I'm not answering your question, but yeah, I don't know that it's as common. It seems to be there to sell the idea of the bookshop, but it doesn't seem to have that cachet it once had. Maybe I don't know. Maybe I'm wrong, but I always do like being told that I'm wrong about the the
No,
current
I'm not
situation.
saying you're wrong. I think if you take the literariness out of it, my question, perhaps I should have articulated a bit better, was about the zeitgeist and the wish of booksellers to create their identity, if you like. So with that, whether it's literary or whatever it is, and again, avoiding the political, which is kind of a separate category, but we do seem now to be going back where bookshops do want to do something that says we're kind of different and friendly, and the journal, the physical journal, is something that I don't know. Yeah, I need to research it, but it just struck me that there's maybe a parallel to be drawn there in terms of what's
Yeah, I know.
happening with book selling.
I think it's so easy now
Mm.
for social media accounts to kind of do that work, to kind of brand the shops. Oliver Darkshire. I'm forgetting the name of the. Why am I
Yes.
forgetting? I mean, he's
Um,
you know,
I know from personal experience back in the 70s, 80s, when desktop publishing and word processing started becoming really easy for people, then a lot of bookstores were putting out a regular newsletter with local stories, local publications, and local, particularly in the countryside, you would have a bookstore would be a focus for the literary community, and they would be centering a publication around what was going on in the store. The store would be involved in the publication of the local poets. Sandpiper magazine, I remember on Cape Cod was one of them.
yeah. I mean, I think it's my point of view is always like you've talked about this, Evan, but like the idea of the independent bookseller, and even that phrase, independent bookselling, which is kind of a later 20th century coinage. I just see it skews the periods a little for me, and I see this developing much earlier. So a lot of the things that we see happening in the late 20th century clearly have these. I mean, Shakespeare and Company is the easiest lineage to track. I mean, you have Shakespeare Company and Shakespeare Company the sequel, and they're clearly taking cues from the original. And so I just that's kind of how I'm seeing it, that this like there's a starting point to this.
Andrew, yep.
Hi, to unmute. Thanks, Matt, for that tour through a number of the bookshops, some of which I know and some which I didn't, but I really enjoyed it. It's kind of that last point had got me thinking, where you said about the links between the different bookshops. And I suppose I was interested in the way that, you were making links between bookshops and literary networks, but I was kind of interested in the way in which booksellers themselves form networks amongst themselves, because I was aware that three of the ones you were talking about, Munro, Steloff, Beach, when Beach starts a bookshop, she goes to Munro for advice and buys stuff off him. And then when Steloff is starting, well, later on, she's already started the Gotham, but she goes to Beach's bookshop in the 20s or 30s, and then she writes to him much later saying, it was such an inspiration to me what you were doing there. And then there's quite a bit of correspondence between them about selling of manuscripts, and Stilov says, I've got a Joyce collector, have you got anything left? And so there's another kind of sense of networks there, I suppose, which is that between booksellers themselves, sharing information, sharing practices, sharing manuscripts for sale, and so on. So I just wonder if you could comment on that. And just the other one was when you mentioned Beach refusing to do the Lady Chatterley edition. Now I'm co-supervising a PhD student at the moment who's working on Lawrence and censorship, and we were looking at this quite closely because it seems to me that Beach's refusal had a number of dimensions to it, really. That there's one where she says, I just didn't want to get this reputation for selling dirty books.
Right.
But also, I think there's some kind of financial stuff because Joyce was such a drain upon her resources, and it was such a stretch. She probably thought, "God, do I want the same thing again with another kind of crazy author?"
Right.
So I think there are kind of a number of different things, and in her, the thing that becomes that short biography, the drafts of it, which I've looked at. She goes through a number of, she tries to word it very differently at
Right.
different points. Huxley sent Lawrence to me, or somebody else said, and then he was a nice guy, and then there was a painter. So she was, I think there were a number of other factors there for her saying no thanks, to that one.
I mean, I think she's not credited enough with how carefully she managed her image, like from the start. Like the first interview she gives that I see, and it was published at Publishers Weekly, I think it's even 1919, or maybe it's 1920. There's an early one, and you can tell that she's completely aware that this is going to be read and seen. And the clue for me about the memoir is that video of her being interviewed a few weeks before she dies. She's like verbatim quoting her book. Like these are stories that she's rehearsed. So I know it's kind of curious because it's somewhere someone claimed that Beach introduced Lawrence to Titus, and I'm like, there's no evidence of this. And if anything, there's evidence that Beach really couldn't stand. There's a letter, I think, where she refers to Mr. Titus as like someone that someone else needs to deal with. Like there's no, I mean, kind of to your first question, that's not a network, it's not a friendly network. That's pure competition in that. So I don't know. It's unclear to me how Lawrence arrives at Titus in that regard. But yeah, you're right. I mean, it's clear it unsettles her. And I think all the reasons you gave her, it's just like I don't want this. With the first question about bookseller networks, yeah, it's clear that there's a lot more communication between booksellers than I think we give credit to. Like they are very aware that other sellers will have kind of specialized in certain stock, or or they'll just ask. Or you have a lot of these like Publishers Circular and others have like these books wanted lists in the back. So you have a lot of this kind of communication going on. Abramson is an interesting case. I mean, this is also kind of getting into the question of bookseller archives. Abramson clearly was writing to everyone every day. There's a lot of indications that he was not shy. But he ordered after his death that his business records be destroyed. So we have no idea of like how he managed. So the correspondence survived. He didn't care about the correspondence. So that's all at Yale. But he did stipulate that the business records had to go. But it does seem like that it's not unique. Like Stelov's experience is not unique necessarily. Yeah, because my other question, and I do write about this, and it's going to be hopefully published next year. We'll see. Beach does. I thought it was curious that Beach knew to go to Harold Monroe and also to Elkin Matthews.
Matthews is
in London. Like it's very. And in records, I mean, like there are, in the Beach archives, there are records of like what she purchased from that trip. So this is not she didn't mismemorize. Sorry, she didn't memorize it. Sorry, she didn't remember this badly. She did go there. But to know to go there was what's been interesting to me. Like this kind of pre-knowledge that she had was interesting.
Yeah, where that comes from, I'm not sure. Does she
I mean, I have a theory. She's yeah, that's another day. I can't track it, I can't prove it, but so
Thanks.
sure.
Any other questions from people? Gail? You're muted, Gail.
Yeah, okay. This is kind of a tangential question in a way. But I was noticing with your US booksellers that a lot of them seem to be Jewish. And I remembered just now that there was a film that was produced about, I think it was about American Jewish booksellers. And I tried to get hold of it, and it was only available in North America. So the tangential question is, could the book Researchers Network get hold of a copy to show it? Because it would be really interesting to see.
Yeah, the booksellers. It's you can,
Booksellers, that's what.
yeah, I mean you can screen it on Amazon, but I don't know where else it's available. This is how I watched it.
What you mean online on Amazon?
Yeah, that's how I don't know if it's available on any other platforms, but that was how they had there is a website for the film.
Yeah.
I
Yeah,
will ask. I did manage to
yeah.
get access for my students to watch it the first year it came out, so I've still got the contacts, Gail. So yeah, I'm willing to give it a go and see if they'd
Yeah.
let us have it, even if they post it and say you can have it for 2 weeks. You know, post the link up. That would be better than nothing,
Oh,
wouldn't
would
it?
be lovely. Very nice. Yes, thank you. Yes, and actually, while I'm asking, I loved what you said, Matthew, but you did go very fast.
I'm sorry. I caught me. Yeah.
All right.
I get excited.
Yeah. So there are a couple of crucial things that I missed. I was very interested in you talking about the reader at Golant, somebody Evans. Now,
Oh, yeah.
were I ever to get back to it, which who knows if I ever will, I have a half-finished PhD about publishers' readers. So I would be interested to know who that person was.
Oh, John Randall Evans. I mean, I think this is how he made his money. So the Sheila Hodges biography of Golantz thanks him in the beginning. So he's aside from the Promethean Society and kind of being behind the scenes with opening Archer's bookshop, because I think Archer was the money that it's really clear to me that Evans kind of arranged all of this. He was also in the late 30s editor of New Leader for a few issues, which I haven't had the opportunity to sit down with. But then he kind of disappears. Like he clearly lives long enough to be a reader for Le Carré's first novel, but I know I tried tracking him down in the hopes that there were papers or something, but he kind of just fades into oblivion at some point in time.
But I mean, that's also interesting because it ties in with my basic hypothesis about the publishers' readers that I've looked at, which is that they were all intellectuals and quite well educated, but they came from families that didn't have very much money, and that they probably would have been publishers if they had had independent money. So it was interesting what you were saying about Sylvia Beach and Helena Rubinstein and all these people who, you know, that was basically what enabled them to do publishing. So it, you know, it confirms my hypothesis. I hope you're going to put that in when you write your next thing so that I can quote you.
Certainly. Certainly.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Oh, Andrew? Oh, you're muted still.
It was just a response to Gail. I mean, I'm in agreement with it that that's most of the case, but the one that is not like that is Frances Steloff, who's Jewish. She's born in a very poor family in Saratoga Springs. She runs away from what is probably an abusive family relationship to New York and works in a department store, gets a job, and then eventually decides to go into bookselling because at one point she's given somebody's sick in the department store, so she has to look after the book part of the department store rather than the hosiery, and she thinks this is better.
Yeah.
And so she gets some money, I think it's a war bond off her sister she borrows, and that's what sets her up to start this. So, you know, she's the one that's very, and when she writes in her autobiography, she says about Beach, she said, you know, me and Beach are often compared, but we were very different in our backgrounds, i.e. Beach had money behind it and I didn't.
Right.
So I think she's a kind of an interesting case that would be against some of the ones that you were talking about.
Yeah. Sorry. Go on, Matty.
Yeah, no, I mean, it is, I mean, there are different, yeah, I mean, everyone's story is so different. It's kind of hard to make an overarching claim, but we have some numbers from, because Madge Jennison writes about this with Sunwise Turn. So, and actually, Ohio, she's gone, Jolie's gone. Okay. So the curator of the special collections that has the Sunwise Turn stuff was here before. They have the stock options, so we kind of know precisely how much it costs to capitalize Sunwise Turn, and from that you can kind of infer how much it would, at least in the late 1910s, how much it would cost to start up a business, or at least of the size that they wanted. And Beach does talk about it being way too expensive to open a shop in New York City, so which makes Steloff's accomplishment seem even more kind of impressive. I mean, maybe they just, yeah, I mean, you know, if you don't already know, for the other people in this meeting, Beach's father was the first minister of I think the Presbyterian Church at Yale, and was close personal friends with the president of Yale, who happened to be Woodrow Wilson. You know, it's like these are the circles her family they're in. They, you know, there's money. She wears it lightly, but this is a moneyed woman, for sure.
So I'm just trying to copy the links.
And also, I mean, and Beach does, I think that, I forget if it's in where this is, but Beach's mother kind of was unhappy with her life. So the money that she gives her daughter is kind of her like wanting her daughter to chase a dream. So it's framed. Like I couldn't have what I wanted. You should go chase your dream.
But was she not happy about her being a lesbian, presume? Well, I shouldn't say.
No, it was no, Beach's mother was unhappy about, I think she trained as a musician in her young life and then got married and then kind of lived a very, you know, standard life as a housewife. And I think this seems to be frustrated her. I think the parents, if they weren't separated, they definitely weren't, there wasn't a lot of closeness towards the end of her life.
Right. And okay.
We have more questions?
How can I find you, Andrew?
Was that for me? Was it?
Yeah.
Oh, you could find me Nottingham Trent. I work. There's an email there. Or have you got a list, Sam? You might be able to just share a.
Yeah.
I'm happy
Yeah.
to do that if you like.
On our website, we've got contact details for everybody.
Yeah.
With their permission, obviously.
Yeah.
I was going to ask Matt, this is just a you know, out of curiosity, those photos of the Bermondsey bookshop, where were they from? Were they like
you can Google this. Someone, I'm sure it's from like the local archives, but someone put together a social media post, or like they had a blog about, I'm not sure how active it is currently, but there is a kind of fan site for the district
Right,
Like
for
it was like a
Bermondsey.
Bermondsey
Yeah.
webpage, and they did a post a few years back about the bookshop.
Yeah.
So I'm imagining they got the photos from the kind of the local
The
local.
local history or something.
Yeah, yeah. So I haven't seen. Yeah, because even like I was really like, so I was going through the publisher circular just generally to see what I could find, what was in there of interest. And I was really shocked to see that they like, all of their events, there's like through the 20s are listed in publisher circular, and it's not a common thing for booksellers to be doing in that publication. So there's clearly they clearly had friends in the publishing world. But yeah, the photos themselves, I was surprised to find them. And then the Ethel Gutman, I think it's even in the same post. It's all from the one. It's very, I think it's pretty easy to Google and locate. But if you can't find it, I'll try and track down the URL. I can get it to you.
Thanks.
Sure.
Okay. It's like we're running out of commentary. I always find this fascinating, the various ways, for me, it's the ways booksellers are using their location, their stock, their clientele in order to develop their commerce, their business, makes it become sustainable in these various ways. Because clearly, I mean, all of these bookstores would have been just on the verge of collapse throughout most of their existence, probably. So these being creative in the various ways and making the most out of your group. Suzanne.
Oh, hi. Oh, I really enjoyed it. Thank you, Matthew.
Sure.
It's a question really about, I really like this idea of friendship being at the core of networks, and that so at the heart of that would be that sort of secret exchange of intimate crossed over with, you know, knowledge is power. And I was just very interested in the sorts of materials that you accessed that were connected to the friendship side of things, whether it was sort of, I don't know, you know, snapshots of them kind of meeting secretly or in their house, you know, that kind of crossover between the really sticky private territories. Because I've been reading about 1950s Charing Cross Road bookshop chaps, and they're always described as these secretive people. And I guess that's where that idea also of kind of magic, you know, the magic connected to the bookshop of the what's underneath the desk and what's hidden behind, and then how that connects to those really private friendships. So it's just a question about that, really.
It's a lot of, I mean, a lot of it is, some of it's archival, like kind of correspondence, but also you get lucky sometimes with people mentioning booksellers in their memoirs. I mean, like David Archer is my favorite because there were 7 or 8 memoirs, and people just writing about their lives, like they're kind of their literary lives. And these are like 3rd-tier authors and hangers-on who there's an interesting unexplored like subgenre of literary memoirs written in the 50s and 60s by aging men who were kind of like at parties with T.S. Eliot, you know, or Auden. It's fascinating. There's a bunch of these. And they all, I mean, with Archer, they always mention him. But the kind of curious thing that all of them skip over, and it kind of, you see it in little pockets, is his homosexuality, which is, it's clear as day when you know where to look, but they don't discuss it. So even the more intimate things are kind of harder to unpick, but it requires a lot of cross-referencing is kind of the problem. And then I don't even a lot of the correspondence you can kind of glean people's attitudes, like whether or not they like kind of how do they refer to each other in the letters. Are they calling someone Titus or Mr. Titus? You know, it's these kind of little subtle things. It took me forever to understand that British men refer to each other by their surnames. That's a familiar way of referring. I mean, it's my American upbringing. So being addressed as, I don't know, Chambers, could it be a form of familiarity? I don't know if that's still true. If you can kind of sense it in the letters.
Depends what school they went to, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, there's that. There's
Quite
definitely that.
class.
Yeah.
I think it's a class thing, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So getting at that kind of requires a lot of inferring, reading between the lines, and a lot memoirs and correspondence seem to be the major way of seeing it. Or you have someone like Beach who just calls Joyce my good friend, and then but in the 1930s, it's like that bastard who's draining me. Yeah, so still, yeah. I don't think she ever says that, but yeah.
Might not say it out loud.
Right.
Yes.
All right. I think that's probably a good place to be finishing up. Yeah, this is anyone else wants to raise one last thing? No? All right, well, thank you very much, Matthew.
Certainly.
Really interesting, really enjoyable. And we'll be seeing everyone in July. What's the date of the?
It's the 12th of July, and it's Lenora Jennings, and she's going to be talking to us about that really exciting project that she started, capturing oral histories of women booksellers in the United States. So that should be fascinating. So yeah, that's on the 12th of July, starting UK time, 2 o'clock again, as per usual, and hope to see some of you then. And thanks, Matt, that was brilliant.
Thank you. Thank you,
Very
everyone. Thank you for your questions.
Thanks, Matt.
See you in July.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye
Bye.
now.